and stay out of the sun. Sun tanning is a relatively modern phenomenon. It was not considered cool not too long ago. Let's look at some facts about the ozonosphere, as we'll call it. And you might say, okay, Bill, what about the so-called holes in the ozone layer? Well, as we have seen, there's no such thing as a magical, mysterious ozone layer, so there can't be any holes in it. However, there is a region called the ozonosphere, which normally has a higher incidence of O3, ozone, than O2, simply and purely because it is a region where a segment of sunlight or ultraviolet light strikes oxygen molecules and converts them into ozone molecules. Now, given the chemical, physical explanation of the ozonosphere as opposed to the hysterical version currently being peddled by the media and those who want to subvert the sovereignty of nations and give up control to take care of this imagined problem. It's not imagined, it's a purposeful lie. It becomes immensely easy to predict that there will be two holes in this said ozonosphere, or not holes. They're just places where this reaction does not take effect at certain times of the year. Now understand that the Earth is always tilted on this axis in relation to the sun. That's what causes us to have summers and winters. So you have to understand that at certain times of the year, as either the South Pole or the North Pole are closer or farther away from the sun, there is an area of the atmosphere directly above either the Arctic or the Antarctic where there is no meeting of oxygen and ultraviolet light. And you notice that these are the only places where they ever take photographs that show that there's no ozone in the atmosphere at that point. Actually, even though they show that there's none, there's always some. If lightning goes through the atmosphere, there's ozone. However, there's not as much as there would be if the sun, the ultraviolet light, were striking oxygen molecules at that point. Does everybody understand that? Gee, I sure hope you do, because I'd hate to start all over and explain this again. I hope you're taping this episode of The Hour of the Time, the only hour that ever was or ever will be or that ever is, the hour during which you will decide your future and thus our collective futures. As I have demonstrated, the so-called ozone layer requires for its very existence that oxygen molecules interact with incoming sunlight or ultraviolet light in order to create ozone molecules which can then be measured and referred to as the magical ozone mantle that protects us from ultraviolet light. Now, as you've already learned, that's a crock of crap, a lie, a blatant, purposeful lie. It's not accidental. It is a real, purposeful lie. Now, there are two places, and only two on the face of the planet, where for a portion of the year no ultraviolet light strikes oxygen molecules, and therefore where there can be no large formation of ozone molecules. Now, folks, I'm referring, of course, to the northern Arctic Circle in the northern hemisphere, winter, and to the southern Antarctic Circle as the southern hemisphere, winter. The Earth, thank God, is not positioned exactly perpendicular to the rays of the sun. If it was, the sun would be overhead in the same place all the time, and the so-called tropical regions would just get hotter and hotter until they became uninhabitable deserts, and the polar regions would just keep freezing. The bulk of the Earth's surface would either be too hot or too cold to live in, with only a thin region where the two extremities met, capable of supporting life as we know it. Fortunately, this is not the case. The Earth is, in fact, tilted over to one side with respect to the sun, and it is this tilt that gives us our seasons. Now, if you could see a picture of the Earth, you would be looking at a representation of the Earth at what is known as the northern hemisphere as the summer solstice. That is, when the sun is directly overhead at the Tropic of Cancer. This is the height of the northern hemisphere summer. As you could clearly see if you had a diagram, no sunlight would be contacting the atmosphere above the Arctic Circle, and therefore there simply could not be any conversion of oxygen into ozone. Hence, there would be a measurable absence in the amount of ozone in the ozonosphere or in the atmosphere at that time. Want to have some fun? Make copies of this tape and send it to your local environmental extremists. Now, environmentalism is good, but extremism and outright deception is bad. Make copies of this tape, send it to all of them, and watch them go down in flames. As the sun's overhead position gradually changes and the sun moves back across the equator, the amount of sunlight reaching the Antarctic Circle gradually increases, thus giving rise to an increase in the incidence of ultraviolet light striking the atmosphere, thus causing this absence to again be filled with ozone, and the so-called hole to shrink. And the same thing would happen at the opposite pole when it went through its winter cycle. And surprise, surprise, there would be a measurable hole there in the amount of ozone in the ozonosphere. After the southern hemisphere solstice, the sun begins its journey northward again, and as we have in Australia slip into our autumn, the hole at the Antarctic Circle starts to grow again. But it's not really a hole. It's just an absence of ozone where the ultraviolet light is not striking oxygen in the atmosphere. And it's not coming down to the earth and burning any humans to a crisp either. You see, it's not happening. Just not happening. This is a natural cycle, ladies and gentlemen, which has existed and will continue to exist for as long as the earth is tilted, the atmosphere contains oxygen molecules, and ultraviolet light continues to come from the sun to convert them to ozone molecules. There are no laws that puny men can pass to stop this awesome forces and these cycles of nature, as King Canute learned when he attempted to order the tides to turn back. Laws to attempt to prevent the natural cycle of absence of ozone in the ozonosphere or in the atmosphere fall into the same category and should be treated with equal contempt. There's nothing you can do to change it. Do you hear me down in Rio de Janeiro? I know this broadcast gets there because this broadcast goes worldwide. Wake up. So where did all this nonsense about holes in the ozone layer come from anyway? Well, folks, back in 1985, the British climatological team in Antarctica discovered that at that particular time in the winter, there wasn't much ozone in the atmosphere at that point. And there was a relatively short bout of hysteria, as always, whipped up by complaint media because the whole thing was in somebody's interest. And that team was down there on purpose. They knew about this. They didn't have to go down there and figure it out. They already knew about it. This was purposefully done to create this hoax so that people would call for control. The only answer is one world government if you fall for the scam. And this was whipped up to bring that about. It was all front-page hype and speculation about how half the world's population would be dead from skin cancer by the year 2000. And similar preposterous stuff. Now, if you think back to late 1985, early 1986, you should be able to remember it all. You should also be able to remember that it had all just died away by late 1986, early 1987, and you heard nothing more about holes in the ozone layer until quite recently. You know why? Well, I'll tell you. You knew I would, didn't you? It all died away because by that time the British scientists at the South Pole had been studying the phenomenon long enough to realize that it was not some hideous, dire threat to mankind's future, but part of a natural, endless, repetitive cycle. They always knew this. And this was actually reported in the papers by the scientists. But naturally enough, not in screaming page 1 headlines, but buried up on page 53 or somewhere back there, between the comics and the obituaries. What was also reported at the time was that the scientists who now knew exactly what they were dealing with were packing up in Antarctica and moving camp to the northern polar regions to test their own predictions that there would be a similar hole there at the opposite time of the year, thereby proving that the holes were not a new threat to the environment and to mankind, but part of a natural cycle, And that, of course, is exactly what they did, and that is exactly what they found. Of course, such a reassurance would not suit those who wish us to live our lives in a constant state of near panic, and therefore